and thank you for joining us today with this. We will have a talk by Mae-ling that will be followed by a workshop where we will be making the tiles that Mae-ling designed, which will ultimately go upstairs in our yet to be finished space. So thank you so much, Mae-ling. Welcome.
Thanks, Kathy. Hi, Brenda. Hi, everyone. So nice to see you all. It wasn't too long ago that Troy was my home and RPI was my world in terms of work. But it's nice to see you all regardless. And thank you so much, Danielle, for doing this workshop, even though I won't be there in person to see how it turns out. I'm sure the photos and just text messages from Kathy might give me just a glimpse of how it went. So I wanted to share with you guys today some of my work, and it's quite informal. Please feel free to jump in at any point in time, particularly if you have questions or comments. So just give me 1 second. So funny. Okay, great. Okay. So over the past decade, I've sort of been working at the intersection of the building, the agricultural, and the food material life cycles. This very much began when I was at RPI, and I sort of had a crisis when I was working, doing my PhD at the Center for Architecture, Science, and Ecology. And we were working on some really high-tech dynamic systems for buildings. And I realized all of a sudden that nothing I was working on would ever make its way to where I came from. And what's more, even if it did, it would be a luxury sort of project. And so I sort of made a decision in my second year of my PhD to work with a material stream that has been in abundance where I come from. For centuries, Africa has exported low-value agricultural goods abroad, and the remnants of that has been waste all across agricultural enterprises on the continent. And so that journey really began by looking at materials coming out of agriculture and making its way into our buildings through upcycling. And over time, I realized that the missing link was the materials that made its way onto our plate, and all of the ways in which, and the quantities of waste that come out of that cycle, not necessarily being super efficient. For me, the building, was such an important place to begin. If we look at the way in which energy is consumed in our world, buildings form the primary consumer of energy, about 40% ahead of transport, ahead of industry. And what's interesting is if you break that 40% down, you'll realize that only 20% of that energy is spent on processing and constructing buildings. But the longer period of the building's lifetime, we spend all of our energy maintaining and operating it. And so for me, I was very interested in understanding how materials, first of all, could employ underutilized material streams like the ones coming out of agriculture, but how also they could not be passive, that they weren't designed from the sort of devoid of participating in the building's operational and maintenance regimes. And so everything to do with breathable material systems, materials that actually improve the air quality instead of leaving all of that responsibility up to our mechanical systems. And I also realized it was very much a question of quality of life, not just quantitative energy. It was also about the fact that we spend probably now, post COVID pandemic era, we spend over 90% of our time indoors. And so we're consistently surrounded by materials that play a disproportionate impact on our health and well-being. And that just, sort of extends from, sorry, there's a lot of noise behind me, forgive me. That also plays a longer impact if we look beyond just when the buildings are surrounding us in our buildings. but all the way from when they leave the ground, when they're produced. So it's a much longer life cycle than one realizes. So we've seen the shift in a number of proactive material streams and standards that are basically helping us figure out how to reduce the amount of energy that goes into producing materials. That has also a cumulative effect in terms of what comes out of that. We see sort of the design of material systems that play a role in reducing the energy load in buildings. And most importantly, we see the elimination of all of these toxic chemicals and pollutants that have found their way into our building materials. So it's in that spirit of this proactive movement that a lot of the work that I've been doing is embracing. By and large, we can understand the way we've typically built and our relationship with materials through this sort of diagram, the horseshoe on the left, which is a sort of material paradigm where we spend so much energy extracting materials from our ground, treating it with heat and a lot of toxic materials, using lots of energy, transporting it across longer and longer distances, where they sort of end up in our buildings. And I'm sure Nature Lab and everyone who's built there knows this process. It's so expensive, and we also don't know all of the ecologies that we're destroying or affecting in the process of constructing our materials and our buildings. And by and large, they sit within our buildings where they don't necessarily play a role within the energy and quality of life that we surround ourselves with, spend a lot of energy maintaining the kind of thermal environments that we so desire now. And they form huge sort of waste problems. A shift from that model, the horseshoe, to something that's more cyclical, where one would be able to source materials that are coming out of other interconnected life cycles, being able to look around us instead of just ahead, and take that as a resource to drive new types of building material systems. And so I found myself kind of a border of academia and industry, looking for opportunities to take these wastes, and through 3 different scales: the material, which is mostly done in labs and in studios in collaboration with other institutions; the module scale, which very much happens at the scale of the studio, and this has primarily happened at RPI, and then actually deploying them somewhere on a building scale. So for me, this is so important because I think often the actual experience, all of the problems that we realize that are barriers to changing our adoption to these materials can't happen unless people actually can relate to it on a one-to-one scale. And so research test beds, as well as opportunities like this, like at the Sanctuary for Independent Media, or a number of art exhibitions, are a very important way for me to engage with the public and a much wider audience. I should mention that the inspiration for most of my work has really come from Ghana, from an artist called Ella Natsui, who in the 60s, 70s, and 80s began experimenting, working with a lot of waste from commodity products. And so in this piece of art, one of my favorites, he basically takes the lid or the caps of bottles and flattens them out in order to construct these hanging sculptures, and transforms the value of something that is completely discarded. In fact, we don't really have uses for them, so they're waste, and actually gives them a new life. And his pieces today sell for over $1 million. So in terms of return and the ecosystem that Ellen Natsui's built around his work, the profits from that are shared very uniformly along anyone whose hand has touched and constructed some of his works. And his work has influenced a generation of peers, of collaborators in Ghana. Ibrahim Mahama works with hemp sacks, hemp sacks that have been carriers for agricultural waste over multiple cycles. Often they carry very clean agricultural products like rice, and over their time, they're recycled for onions and other low value or lower value agricultural crops. On the right is work using the gallon, so the plastic gallons that are typically used to carry oil, And this is very commonly used in cooking and energy, for cooking and energy in parts of the city that aren't connected to the grid. And so that symbolic use of this infrastructure, sort of kitchenware or houseware, is reconstructed as art. So inspiration very much came from home, but my work started to look at renewable biopolymers, and there's just an infinite number of sources that we can tap into to activate a very different material stream. Most of my work has been concentrated around lignocellulosic products. So these are stuff that are very much associated with agricultural waste. And obviously through working with some of the mycelium technologies that have come out of companies, particularly one in Troy, Ecoeffective, I started to also engage with that. So I'm happy to share a few projects. And if there are any questions, please, just jump right in. Agricultural waste was such an important place to begin, mainly because of the sheer scale at which we're generating it. And it's very much tied to our growth as a human species. The more we grow, the more food we need to eat. And that also drives this huge production of material waste. So we knew that about 10 years ago, we were producing about 1 billion megagrams of materials just for food. And it's kind of crazy to think that only a third finds its way onto our plates, and a much larger percentage is actually either prematurely downcycled or burnt in open air. So we haven't developed the mechanisms for being patient and for finding out what these wastes are used, or could be used for, before they are ready to return back to the ground. And looking at all of the largest sources of agricultural wastes or agricultural byproducts, I sort of started off looking at the waste from coconut. And it isn't by and large the most widely available or the most widely produced. But what was interesting about it was the fact that if you break down the husk, which is the waste byproduct, it had a really high percentage of some really strong fibers, the lignin components, and had very little sugar. So it lent itself to a whole range of interesting applications, particularly for buildings. The other thing is coconut is sort of in the hands of farmers all along the tropical equator that make less than $1 a day. And so the fact that we might turn what was a waste problem in their backyards into an opportunity for generating revenue was also a huge driver for the work. So it was through the coconut that I had my first encounter with mycelium. I was sort of researching, taking that waste, as you can see over here. A lot of coconuts are drunk in cities. This is also part of a global trend. Coconut is the new superfood. Everything coconut butter, coconut oil. I sound like the guy in the shrimp guy in Forrest Gump. It's just, it never ends, the coconut uses. But that is a very common scene, as you can see over there on the streets of Accra, Ghana's capital, where you have just piles of coconut husks produced daily. And at night, they're sort of burnt illegally because you're not actually allowed to dispose them in waste systems. They're just too heavy. And so we were trying to figure out how to bind components of the husk to give a number of different products, from insulation all the way to stuff like oak. And one of the ways that we were able to experiment with how strong or how thermally acoustic or mechanically efficient these boards could be, we started looking at fungal mycelium among other types of bioglues. Another was soy, which came from a company in Ithaca. Upstate New York has such a rich community of people working with bioadhesives. And in Ghana, we were working with the actual pith. So it's when you break apart the coconut husk, you get the fibers and this dust that we found out was a very efficient bioadhesive as well. And I wanted to show this photo because this panel was one of our first prototypes that was pressed with coconut and soy on the exterior. And on the interior was actually one of Ecoeffective's earlier substrate, which was corn, and mycelium was fed to fungal mycelium. And so what we had in that first prototype was a compromise and a collaboration between different types of agricultural waste and fungal mycelium. Initially, when we had pressed this and it was fully made out of coconut, it was just such a heavy panel, incredibly heavy, was really bad at absorbing sound. And so the mycelium and the corn in there gave a much lighter panel, really helped us deal with thermal and acoustic absorption. And so it's one of my favorite projects, and till this day, I'm still learning a lot from it. And we also sort of, from the module scale, displayed it in Ghana in a contemporary arts festival. And it was really interesting to engage with a wider audience from workers, carpenters, welders, people who had no idea that you could take this waste and actually form a very robust building material. In contexts like Ghana, it's incredibly challenging to work with anything natural or bio-based because everybody wants something like concrete, glass, and steel that's going to last for a long time. So it's very challenging to change people's social perceptions around these materials. And from that initial encounter with mycelium, to me, mycelium was really interesting technology to overcome what I thought were the failures of the coconut boards and technology, mainly because you required energy and lots of it to control the temperature and pressures to get a product like this. And what was interesting about mycelium was the fact that this could be done, as you guys will find out today, at room temperature by covering it up and giving the mycelium enough moisture in there, and by using agricultural waste. And so I was very interested in actually working with this species to think about new ways of redesigning how we produce materials. And so for me, it began in an art exhibition in Liverpool. And I just want to show you a few projects that will introduce the tile. But the idea that one could, instead of centralizing and having really high energy intensive infrastructures for producing materials, that you could do this in a distributed way. You could develop all of the kit of parts that would allow someone to do this in their kitchen or on a community scale or even on site. And so that was the premise for this exhibition in Liverpool with the Royal Institute of British Architects, where we wanted to actually grow the entire installation in the gallery itself. And so right in the center of the gallery is a grow chamber, which was really scary to do because I was just so afraid an infection would happen. And then we actually engaged over 200 people ranging from the ages of 6 all the way to 70, 80. So a number of urban farmers, people who had been farming in the city ever since the culture of plots for farming in Liverpool after the World War had, taken off. So this is one of our first workshops in an urban farm called Squash Nutrition in Liverpool. And engaging with this grow it yourself workshop technique that Ecology had developed, we produced trays, and Danielle has been a collaborator on these trays. And this hemp sort of waste that you're also going to be using today with mycelium. And we grew this with kids in the urban farm. What's so interesting about Liverpool is every school actually has land dedicated to farming. So this urban farm is not just on like a dedicated piece of land, but it's distributed in the city through schools. And, we put little components like pieces of wood that would allow our panels to have lips. So you could actually fasten them and screw them into a wall very easy. Each kid had, a tray, and I love the human scale sizes of these trays. One can carry it. It's not too heavy even for a child of 6. We did this in high schools. We also did this in universities. And then we grew them after they had been inoculated in the trays in the gallery. And the students actually came to actually install it in a tunnel that's actually at the start of the gallery itself. So we built out that sort of entrance tunnel. I actually just rebuilt this tunnel in a solo exhibition a couple of weeks ago. And so you can see the wall more. We never really got really good pictures of that tunnel, but this space allows you to see, the tunnel in its full glory. And there's an acoustic piece playing in here, which is just really nice because of all the absorptive performance of the panels. And so that exhibition sort of activated expanding the type of waste that one could feed to fungal mycelium. And I started over the last 4 years, I've been working with a foundation in the south of France called Luma, where they have, they're quite unique because 60% of France's organic crops are produced in this region, the Camargue region. And we started to map the diversity and the richness of agricultural food waste. So this began to engage with the food industry because they had a rich economy around collecting food waste that we also were interested in seeing how they would fare with building materials. So we grew things like lavender or fungal myco boards made out of lavender, olive oil, rosemary, sunflowers, a lot of citric-based food waste, which worked really well. And because that opened up a much larger inventory, we were trying to deduce a pattern around, could we begin to see or lens all of these materials through those two components, the sugar stuff, the cellulose, as well as the lignin, the structural stuff, and predict whether a specific be able to vary with the mycelium. And this is also tied back into research at RPI that my students started doing in terms of mechanical testing with different wastes. And much like the coconut project, the method of production was so important to us. And so we started to think about both centralized and decentralized bottom-up ways of building using everyday objects. And so the architectural studio, as well as through a collaboration with a food kitchen in Arles in France, we started generating different prototypes. So the first was building these sort of cylindrical mycelium blocks and very quick ways of assembling simple joinery to assemble larger scale structures. And so we built a sort of like this dome structure. I'm going to admit it wasn't very structurally successful, but for good reasons, we figured out how to correct it. But this is an example of the really simple joints. This is just waste wood from the workshop and binding wire. And all of these little multiple connections help to transfer the force. The issue with the structure, I should mention, was that we had huge holes because we were trying to have views to the sky. But we've sort of realized how that compromised the structure, particularly under a summer where we had intense rain in Troy. But that was sort of a rendering of the structure that went right in front of the green building. We actually flipped that. Gustavo, who was teaching this studio over the summer, for an exhibition in the forest in the Netherlands this summer. So just wanted to show a video of that. And so this was like a really large scale inverted mycelium dome that was shown in the Arnhem Forest this summer. You can see it also over here much more clearly. You'll see it's bowing here. And like any public work of art, it's meant to engage with the public, but apparently there was a group of youth that were running away from the police and decided to hide in the structure. And so it was interesting. I was surprised that the structure held actually under the weight of a few people, but it was climbed on top of. But that's just a video showing people engaging with it. Also in Arles, and this is quite similar to what you might be doing today, is we had individual panels that would accept other types of objects, also grown by everyday materials or arts or plants, that would infill the spaces between the panels. And so this was grown for a community kitchen called the Kitchen Collaborative, which has a rich mixture of North African, French, West African residents that use and cook for the community. And what we decided to do initially was to grow objects that would hold things that needed to be used on tables in the kitchen. But over time, and since this took place over the pandemic, they realized the huge issue was being able to source and share really interesting species of seeds in the community garden that was literally a few meters away from the kitchen. And so we actually are developing it to become a seed wall, a plant and seed wall with ceramic capsules inside. And I thought it'd be interesting to show this because there's also that opportunity in between the panels that you're growing today to put something that might relate to the exterior neighborhood or environment or programming in terms of integrating plants or seeds or art. So that was just installed a couple of weeks ago, and we're still building out and sourcing some of the seeds that can be shared among those who are involved with the community kitchen. And I kind of wanted to end on an introduction to the tile that you're growing today. The pattern of which, the surface texture pattern of which was inspired by the movement of the cap of a mushroom organism as it's beginning to reach maturity. And so also last week, we installed this sort of landscape installation called Healing Meadow, made out of those panels. Typically, they're used in a wall configuration, but we actually put them as a floor landscape. Plants known to the region around Hasselt. And plants that we know are very close to the human body in terms of healing. So you'll see that over there, and you can probably deduce some of the shapes that I was just talking about, particularly around the oyster mushroom specifically. And so, yeah, I just wanted to end with that. I also know that there are talks going on about what could be in between the panels that you're growing today, and whether that's plants or art. It's a wall that's meant to interact with a number of different objects and not necessarily be a monolith on its own. So I'm very excited to see what you guys come up with.
Sorry. I also want to give a big shout out to Danielle Marino, who's sitting here, who is going to be one of the people who's going to lead a designer who's going to help us lead the workshop. So thank you, Danielle. May, I just wanted to say that I loved your presentation. Thank you so much. And I'm wondering, are you working with any other products or waste products in Ghana besides the coconut husks at this point? And maybe you could just briefly describe some of the projects that you're involved in right now.
Yeah. So the other waste that we've been working on is primarily for water treatment. And, again, in responding to some of the barriers of the social barriers of using these materials, we decided to think about using agricultural waste to treat water because that's such a huge problem. And so we've been working with the waste byproduct of a plant called moringa. It's typically used for tea and oil. You can find it in Whole Foods. It's another one of those superfoods, whatever a superfood means. But the waste byproduct is something like a flour. It's like bread flour, but it's when you add it to really toxic water, particularly textile waste water that has a lot of dyes and heavy metals. The moringa press meal is very good at binding all the bad and heavy stuff together and allowing it to settle. So it's a great flocculant. And so we've been using that to treat the water coming out of a company's distributed cooperative of women throughout the country. And they're sort of scaling that project up because they're building a centralized or semi-centralized factory in the eastern region where a lot of the women live. And so being able to scale it up from something that's sort of a home technology to almost like a semi-centralized factory is sort of a huge challenge and opportunity that we're engaged with right now. Another, byproduct that has been really important for me to use is cocoa pods. Ghana is one of the world's largest producers of high quality chocolate. Should have been called the chocolate coast, not the gold coast. But the pods are also a waste byproduct that we're also trying to develop for other types of applications. Much like the coconut, they are downcycled prematurely into basically soil substitute media, for hydroponics, for nursing saplings of crops like rubber. But there is another life. We believe that these waste, the husks, can live before they're sort of downcycled. And many a time, a lot of these wastes have such high water content that to put them or to combust them so early is actually a waste of energy. So there's a sort of life cycle timing that is so important with working with these materials. So that's some of the wastes. The thing that I've been working on since I left RPI in Ghana has been rice. And rice is such a loaded, food in this country because it's began to occupy nearly 60% of all plates. Like, it's substituting so many carbohydrates, and very nutritious carbohydrates that it's beginning to replace. And most of it is imported. And I don't know if you guys know much about rice, but there are two varieties in the world. One's Asian, one's African. And the African cultivars are really, we're losing an extreme rate, the biodiversity, because no one's growing them anymore. So over the summer, we've been sort of working on a project that's actually a flood control project, but we sort of made it a Trojan horse for introducing rice back into the urban environment, because rice loves water and can tolerate high levels of water, especially during the rainy season. And so we were able to source 119 cultivars of rice that haven't seen this landscape for the last 200 years. And we're growing them on a small scale, obviously, at first, before we deploy them into the public realm. But for us, that's been around a project around food security, around thinking about how do we also expand our understanding of the lives of plants like rice, not just for food, but for a whole range of other things, or just to simply be in a public space. So that project is 6 weeks in, and the rice are thriving, some not. We're also realizing all of the problems with water in the city, in terms of what we put into it, and how that ends up in our plants. So yeah, just some of the things and materials that we've been working on here include rice as well as moringa.
You basically lift this up, and I'm gonna let Ben do the heavy lifting today. So lift it on its side, and then sort of pound into it as hard. Yeah, like this, and you really want to break up the growth as much as possible, and then you can flip it again. Yeah. And you can see as he's breaking it up, there's a layer of mycelia on the outside. Do you want to try? Just hit it on the bag. Yeah. This is the fun part. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. All right. It's a good cover band. All right, you can flip that again. Yeah, so now you can't see as much mycelium, but it's all still in here. It's all still living. So now that it's mixed up a little bit, we're gonna spray the top of the bag, just because we're about to open it, so we don't want any contaminants on there. And then we can take the scissors, and I'm also gonna let you do this and dump it into one of those. Sure. That's the form. Make a fan. Yeah, exactly. Yes. Yep. Well, we don't actually even make it in-house anymore. We get it shipped to us. From where? Pennsylvania.
I have a question. How does the alcohol interact with the culture?
It
Does it
doesn't. It
do
doesn't
anything?
harm it. So this stuff like evaporates pretty quickly. So yeah, it's not harmful unless you're like spraying it directly on there.
Okay.
Oh yeah. Awesome. So now we'll take one of our forms. Oh yeah, let's add the flour in first. So we've already portioned this out, but it's typically about 70 grams of flour for 10 bags or 10 pounds of mycelium. So we'll just sprinkle that in there.
What cups that is, or
It's like one cup ish.
1 cup per 10 pounds?
Yeah. Ish.
Cool.
So you'll see there's some chunks of flour. So this is just additional food for the mycelium. It helps it grow a little bit better. But we want to break up those chunks because they tend to attract more possibility of contamination if it's a big chunk of flour. So we want to make sure all of that's broken up and spray. Anytime you're about to touch the mycelium, you want to spray down your gloves. Make sure. And then you can just go in and mix it up. You can mix that side if you want.
What are the most common things that contaminate?
There's all sorts of things. I would say, so our strain of mycelium is fairly robust, but sometimes things can outcompete it. It could be all types of like molds or bacteria contamination. So I wish I had some pictures of what those look like, but
We've been having some trouble recently with fungus called Crisnalia,
yep.
as well as trichoderma.
Yeah, those are pretty common.
Very fast growing molds. So
I'm sorry.
they can take over even more quickly than a colonized
Like this.
substrate like this. So they're very fast growing.
So if you see this is an example of the mycelium just growing together and really binding all of that. So once we fill the mold, like the forms, the mycelium will bind all these chips together like that. That's what it does best. We'll start to eat.
The chip is also their nutrients.
Yeah,
kind of.
yeah, it's food, yeah. So that looks pretty good, I think.
Just over time, do the tiles keep changing, or do they get like frozen at some point?
So what we'll do, we'll fill the forms and then cover them and let them grow for 4 days. And then after 4 days, we'll remove them from this form and let them overgrow. So that's like the internal growth. We'll let them overgrow to get like a fuzzy layer of overgrowth for 2 more days. So then after that time, then we dry it and that sort of freezes them to prevent them growing mushrooms, because this is just the root structure of the mushrooms.
Good.
Yeah, and then you can fill, I think this is already sprayed, so.
Oops.
Oh boy.
Give me a chair.
Can I take this chair?
I think you're probably better off on that than something.
Nice. Yeah. Oh, we got a chunk of flour.
One more.
Yeah.
What do we miss?
Every single bit.
Exactly. Great. So you want to fill it up kind of all the way to the top, and then we have these smoothing plates right over there. And that will flatten that out. Yep. Yeah, we want to spray those, and we're gonna put the blocks in before we spray.
What are you spraying it with? What are you disinfecting it with?
IPA, isopropyl alcohol.
So it doesn't hurt the mycelium.
Doesn't hurt the mycelium. No.
Actually, the mycelium is kind of grown into the wood. And so it's, even if you spray the ISO on the surface of the wood, it might kill the mycelium on the surface, but then there's still that mycelium in the middle that can survive and come back up.
There we go. We'll flatten it out, and then we're gonna add the blocks. So this kind of helps get us. Fill a little bit more, a little overfilled there and a little underfilled here. Another trick is, see all this out here outside of the form? If you brush that in, it will help prevent flashing, which is when the mycelium grows out of the form, and then you have to trim it off. So that's something to just be conscious of. Yeah, like over there. A little bit in the corner. Yeah. Then you can that's good enough for now, because we're going to add the blocks. So we've got some blocks under here. Yeah. And you want to dig out a little bit of material.
Is this how you, yeah.
What was it? Tell us.
The question was that these blocks are in there so that you can hang them on a wall,
Yes.
and we're using L hooks for that, so.
I mean, so when this is done, we'll add the L hook to the block.
Yeah, because you
after,
can screw into
yeah.
it.
So
Hang
once
on
the
a minute.
mycelium starts to grow, like these wood blocks are just going to be fixated in there.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, the mycelium will grow right into the blocks. And we've soaked these with hydrogen peroxide.
Okay.
So it cleans basically any potential for contamination. It gets rid of that as much as possible. Just the store-bought stuff.
Straight out
I
of
think
the bottle.
3% or something. I think it's 3%.
No, I was just wondering if you diluted it or.
No.
Okay. Cool.
But that stuff is diluted.
Right.
It's not straight. So, when we come back in,
Yeah.
these forms are a little tricky because they tend to rock back and forth. But that's sort of what you want to end up with. And I might add a little bit here. It's not quite full there, but you can sort of perfect it. But it's yeah, so if everyone, I'd say that's good. And then we're also going to cover them, but we can do that after.
Oh my. What do you think?
Oh, look at that.
Would you like to do one of these?
Yeah, the bears.
Okay.
Those are
We have
awesome.
two of them.
Cool.
I'm gonna do a bear house.
Cool.
Yes.
These are embers.
Bear tiles.
Wow.
Woo!
So we can also put saran wrap over it, which we can do sort of after we fill
I'll
them.
do that.
Should we go to a bear one?
Yeah, I would say everyone
Come
can
do a
grab
bear.
a form, maybe team up. 2 people per form.
So you have 3 stations, right? There's 1, 2, 3 stations. Wow.
Are these,
Super
are these
cool.
both the same thing?
Yeah.
No, don't worry.
What do you want to be on this side? You want to be this side?
You're gonna make little teddy bears.
Little mushroom bears. Dream to make
Yeah.
a mushroom bear.
Use the mushroom.
I know he's a mushroom.
Oh, Andy, you wanna punch out a bear? Just move this.
Whoa, you gotta hit that.
Here you go. Go right
All
ahead.
right, anger management.
Yeah, there you go.
Too appropriate. If you really need a mycelial punching bag, spray all of it to us. Oh, yeah. Punch it out.
Good thing is the meat is already.
That feels good.
Make him do it.
Oh, my God.
I got some, thank you. Rated 5. Go.
This is good. I like that. Okay, do we need to break this up?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Remember, will you do me a favor, we coexist to this? It has to be broken up. You can't have any lumps in there. Okay, here, let me spray your hands. Oh, you're gonna do it, great.
So she is not.
Ready? Ready for another spray?
No.
Here you go, give me, put those,
That we
I'll
do
hold
it,
this.
no?
good.
She's not.
She's not.
No,
Don't
washing
think she's
machine.
When you're washing your hands.
Oh. Okay, ready, guys? Check for lumps. For lumps.
I don't understand, my partner is
We're
over
gonna have to get
there.
rid of that.
Amber was my partner. He left.
You lost your partner. You were
Listen.
abandoned for the teddy bears. It was the teddy bears.
Amber, you left me for the restaurant. I can't believe it. Next time I take that form.
Bears win.
Bears win.
Bears win.
He's like, well, you know, Eileen, you're fun, but these bears, I'm way more fun than you.
I mean, mushroom bears.
Exactly.
That's so nice.
Yeah, sure.
I was imagining myself getting lying in this for 4 days and
And being
I've been
growing,
looking
being
out.
growing.
Oh, okay. It's because you're 2 against 1.
Thank you.
The good thing is that this, you know, will be in display for the People Health Sanctuary and represents the community that we are trying to build, that we all share in our strengths and resources. And like the mycelium, we're all connected. We are creating all these networks. And this is basically like one of the activities that represent what the People Health Sanctuary will be in the future. And crossing that is happening. We are building the future. So this is really special. That Mae-ling, I hope you see this, but
Close to me in Troy. But
you are
like
creating
4 a.m.
important artwork using sustainable
playing music
materials that will last forever, but also has an important legacy, which is the fact that the mycelium is at the bottom of our earth, but help connect all the trees and all basically the community through the mycelium. It's like an important network that brings communication between them, help them about threats and about the environment that all these trees and these plants are living. So we, the human beings, are like myceliums, connecting each other, communicating, using our networks to spread knowledge. That's what the Center for Independent Media is doing, in creating inclusion, participation, and that we all bring our knowledges to create a better world. And it's happening here in North Troy and the capital region and beyond. So this is really important work that we're doing here. Amazing. I think I almost made my form.
That's beautiful.
Almost.
We'll check with Danielle.
Are these?
And it's going to be interesting to think about how the community decides to fill the holes in between each tile. That's such a infinite possibilities of how to fill the space.
Exactly. We can do flowers of the area in the spring. We could even do water bottles, like in representation of our river keeper. You know, water. There is the possibilities are endless. Or art work from the different interns. It will be interesting.
Or messages from the community.
Yes, that too. Where is the, oh, you have it, okay. I think I need to borrow that.
Looking good. Just clean.
Wow, look at those
clean the
mushroom
edges up a little
pears.
bit.
I don't understand. Won't they be separate bears? Then don't you want to have those in there?
They
too?
don't have enough blocks.
Oh, they don't.
But
have
it's
enough
okay.
blocks.
We don't need blocks.
No, you just have a bear.
Yeah. We're saying we
It
might
can
want
be
to
like a
sleep with
bear.
them, you know?
Yeah, a bear that runs around.
Yeah. Cool, Abby.
You know, it's do more.
We're ready.
You could help Eileen.
There's also another. Should we do a tile or should we do a tile this time?
A tile next. Here, he made a bear. Oh, aren't they cute? No, they don't have enough of them.
Oh, okay.
Do you know what, Amber? You know what Eileen was just saying, Amber? She was saying that people are like mushrooms. Do you think that people and mushrooms might be the same?
No, but look, Amber, this mycelium is at the bottom. The mushroom is what we see out in the top and what we eat. Where's the mushroom? Oh, well, this is it will be like the roots. Think about mycelium is like the roots of the mushroom. So we eat the mushrooms, but this is the roots, what we don't see. Now I'm gonna have to go to his house and bring a mushroom and then say, look, this is the mycelium at the bottom. I love our children are so special. He says, no, we're not like mushrooms. No.
Excellent job, team.
Thank you. Thank you.
Awesome. Meet me here.
So when you
That's it. That's it. Happy here.
You could even do it on the table.
You're the taper?
Yeah.
Hey,
And then tape.
what are you doing here? You're making it so this,
There's
no air.
Saran wrap doesn't come off, and then we're gonna just store them for a few days, and then we'll get ready to use them. Woo.
We typically have lids or like this kind.
You know, a group of children.
Yes, it is. I think it would be so great to have a sculpture in the garden that has like seeds in it and grows throughout the year. And that like as the rain goes, it transforms and like just becomes a living.
Can they be outside? Can they survive outside?
Oh, I don't know about these. But,
Can these survive outside?
Yeah.
They can, Sina, they can.
Yeah, especially if they're intact. So the mycelium is hydrophobic. So if it rains, like the water will just run off of it. It'll probably get discolored, like it'll get yellowish or like different colors in it. But it's cool. It stays intact. Like we had a cooler sitting outside for a mushroom cooler for probably a year, and it was still relatively intact. Even through the winter, but after a year, maybe not so much.
Is that full enough, that one?
No, right?
Yeah, I put a little bit more in there.
Where? Like everywhere? or-
Like here, anywhere you can see the edge of the thorn. Yeah.
making materials out of waste. Like, is it too, like, not sterile? That's the answer. Like, it's contaminated, environment.
As long as you have isopropyl. Yeah. That's one.
Like you'll see like all the way mycelial growth. And then you'll see it's
Think about questions after the fact.
Oh yeah.
But I was thinking, like, what made her do this? Do you know? What made her work on mycelium? Like, well, she said it kind of with the coconuts.
Yeah,
Then lead her to this.
With the coconuts, she was looking for a lighter solution, and since she was working at RPI, Ecoeffective is like right across the river and was started by a couple RPI alumni. So they
Shout out to Bert Swarzy.
yeah,
Their teacher. He's here in the room. Hello, Bert.
So yeah, they definitely. May was and it just made sense.
No, you guys work fast. This team is good.
So do we read plastic now with the
Sure, yeah.
islands to?
Out of the substrate. So we can get this.
All right.
One more time.
Ready? Beautiful. Okay, let's clean off the.
So there's a lot of really cool potential.
Are you glad you came, Emmy?
This is a party.
Kept waking up saying, "Are we going yet?"
Really?
So
Awesome.
that's like the pillow that grows on top.
They're so pretty.
Wow. And then you can see them after harvest. And this is all of the mycelium on top of like basically this type of tray. It grows up out probably like this high.
Okay, but that's combined with other elements to make it like this, or is only mycelium?
This is only mycelium, and what's the substrate?
Try the
that
other
we grow
one.
in this?
Oh, that's not good,
Yeah.
Kathy.
Proprietary.
Yeah, that's too much.
It's just like a wood.
But you know what? We need to do
If you would have gone the other side though, the other way.
If we think about it,
Vertically.
we are getting out of resources. We killing the earth, like I was reading about the
Are we ready for
cement,
another one?
that because we
There's one right
have
behind you.
Yeah. That's like.
sand, and without sand, you can't do the cement.
Right.
And I'm like, sand? What the hell? That's infinitive. I thought like, I will never do it. But yeah, there is a shortage of sand. So we
Like
need to
drop
look
off,
at
like,
other avenues to be able to build. Do you think it's fine? I think now looks better than before.
Yeah, that's perfect.
You need your blocks
There you go.
Oh, no, but I have to do this first.
before
To
the block.
see- Yeah, and then do.
More bears.
So I actually incubated.
Okay.
Yeah, I just started 2 months ago. Actually.
Okay.
And how did you hear about this? I didn't.
Oh, this event.
Yeah.
I was hanging with my friend Adam last night, and he was like, "Have you heard about this workshop?" And he knew
Adam at the castle.
the castle. Oh yeah, yeah, you were there. He said that the lady who presented was his architectural professor.
Oh, May, yeah.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Oh, that's how you learn. That's cool.
I was wondering, I'm like,
And it just take a little bit.
I didn't promote this at all.
I know. And I was like, "Oh, that's my friend."
Yeah.
I just prepared.
I need to say a little bit.
Yeah.